We give this Scarlatti sonata 5 out of 5 hammers. First, because Scarlatti revolutionized the art of composition from Spain. We also explain which compositional details won us over, and what makes it so much fun for pianists to play. During the Baroque era, Scarlatti developed playing techniques that anticipated even Chopin's piano style. But we'll also tell you how a misunderstanding in the early 20th century initially prevented his works from being properly understood. Today, they are part of the world's pianistic cultural heritage. The Neapolitan harpsichordist and composer Domenico Scarlatti, born in 1685, the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach, spent much of his life on the Iberian Peninsula. At the age of 34, he took up a post as court music director in Portugal. Unfortunately, we no longer know what he composed there, as all the sheet music from that period was lost in the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. However, as early as 1729, he had followed his employer, the Portuguese Princess Maria Bárbara de Bragança, to Spain. She married the future King Ferdinand IV. We know little about Scarlatti's daily life and working methods. He was apparently rather discreet and was regarded as polite and reserved. However, Scarlatti had to contend with two surrogate fathers. On the one hand, there was his biological father, Alessandro Scarlatti, a composer no less famous in his day, but who apparently wanted to control his son more than the latter would have liked. Domenico therefore had his official independence from his father formally documented in 1717. The second superfather was Johann Sebastian Bach, who outshone everyone and set the standards for Baroque composition. Bach and Scarlatti are said to have held each other in the highest regard. Domenico also maintained an extremely respectful relationship with Handel. He is said to have lost a musical duel against Handel on the organ in Rome. In return, however, Handel had to admit defeat against him on the harpsichord. Domenico seemed to have been the undisputed master of masters on this instrument. In particular, he was regarded as a pioneer of playing with all 10 fingers. Until his death in 1750, Bach composed his final great legacy, the Art of Fugue. In it, the full power and depth of Baroque compositional art is revealed, artfully interweaving independent voices in polyphony and flowing ceaselessly like an endless river. The rules were complicated, the structures exceedingly dense, intended more for God than for humankind. At the same time, the Enlightenment thinkers began to lay the foundations for new social, political, and aesthetic principles that made the mature individual, and no longer heavenly or earthly authorities, the measure of all things. This is also reflected in a new form that replaced the contrapuntal fugue as the benchmark, the sonata form and its main variant, the sonata first movement form. It contrasts melodies, plays with them, and replaces polyphonic heaviness and density with transparent playfulness and wit. Scarlatti was already experimenting with this form in a pioneering manner, even before the ink on Bach's final manuscript had barely dried. According to the catalogue of works by Scarlatti scholar Ralph Kirkpatrick, the sonata that is probably best known and most frequently recorded today bears the number 380. It possesses the rudimentary form of the sonata form, an exposition with a theme that leads to a second theme in the dominant key. A development section introduces harmonic and formal complexities that ultimately lead into a recapitulation. Unlike later versions by Haydn and Mozart, however, the recapitulation in this sonata is limited to the reprise of the second theme. Scarlatti also anticipates a compositional technique of the Viennese classical period. He artfully weaves interlocking and asymmetrical elements into a compelling whole. The exposition's theme consists of 2 4-bar phrases, though the repetition occurs in the lower register. Just as Mozart would later do, Scarlatti now strings together one melodic idea after another. A scale passage now spans just 3 bars. He repeats a 1-bar motif, a shortened version of the first motif 7 times, harmonizing and modulating it differently each time until the conclusion in the dominant key. In doing so, he follows a fundamental narrative pattern, condensation. He has now reached the dominant key, time for the secondary theme. It takes up the fifth of the first theme, but mirrors the scale motif. The bar pattern is now 3 and 5, though shortened to 3 and 4 in the repetition. A melodically varied version of the secondary theme, condensed into 2 bars, introduces the coda, which is again 5 bars long. The music is thus clear on the one hand, yet not regularly structured. Scarlatti also imbues it with a luminous quality by drawing on horn motifs and frequently using chords without thirds. The latter allows him, in the subsequent development, to often leave open whether a major or minor key is intended. The development is in 2 parts. It begins once again with a 4-bar dominant tonic chain that appears to return to the key of E major. But then Scarlatti surprises us with a tense chord. Jazz musicians would probably read it as 2 superimposed chords. In the bass, an A major chord with a diminished 5th and a major 6th. Above this, in the melody, a diminished B-sharp chord. The chord is part of a classical 2-5-1 cadence leading to C-sharp minor. The C-sharp minor is reinforced with 2-5-1 cadences. The first 8 bars are thus a sequence in E major and its parallel key, C-sharp minor. Scarlatti now picks up from the end of the E major cadence, but swaps beats 1 and 2 as well as 3 and 4 in a G-sharp major chord, which he enriches in the following bar to a G-sharp major 7th chord with a Phrygian minor 9th. We thus remain in C-sharp minor for the time being. What follows is a borrowing from Spanish popular music. This is the so-called Andalusian cadence, which every guitarist knows well because it is widely used in flamenco. The Andalusian cadence begins on the minor tonic and descends step by step through the notes of the natural minor scale to the 5th degree, that is, 1 in minor, minor 7th in major, minor 6th in major and 5th, also in major. On the guitar, this generally means descending from a minor via G major and F major to E major, or the E major 7th chord as the dominant. After establishing C-sharp minor, Scarlatti briefly inserts a triad that could be understood as a major, and thus the mediant of C-sharp minor. However, this is a step towards F-sharp minor, followed by an Andalusian cadence in F-sharp minor. Scarlatti repeats the Andalusian cadence once more, but this time in B minor. A 1-4-1-5 cadence then leads into the recapitulation of the secondary theme. To us, the development section still seems somewhat clumsy and the modulations rather haphazard. For the masters of the form, Haydn and Mozart, the development section in sonata form was the grand showcase in which they could demonstrate their perfect mastery of the balance between harmonic surprises, motivic work, and complex formal development. A well-intentioned misunderstanding prevented a proper appreciation of Scarlatti's authentic works in the 20th century. To understand this, one must first realize how the composition and publication of musical works changed over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. Broadly speaking, composers increasingly claimed more control over various aspects of music. Whilst during the Renaissance it was sufficient for them to notate note durations and pitches and leave the interpretation to the musicians within established conventions, they increasingly prescribed articulations and ornamentation, until they eventually laid down dynamic instructions in all their subtleties. Thus, by the end of the 19th century, control over interpretation had shifted increasingly from the performer to the composer or editor. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Italian musicologist Alessandro Longo undertook the task of making Scarlatti's collected sonatas accessible to pianists. In doing so, he made some problematic decisions. For instance, he grouped individual sonatas more or less arbitrarily into suites. Above all, however, he supplemented the musical text, entirely in keeping with the compositional practice of his time, with his own ornamentation, dynamic markings and instructions on pedal use, which are entirely foreign to music written for the harpsichord. On the harpsichord, the E major sonata Kirkpatrick 380 sounds something like this. If transposed one-to-one onto the modern piano, one would obtain a result something like the following. To pretend that the piano is a harpsichord is unsatisfactory, for the modern grand piano requires interpretation through touch, dynamics, and pedal to be convincing. It is not, therefore, that Longo did not carry out his editorial work with taste and skill. His editions have survived the century and can still be a source of inspiration today. His arrangement of the sonata in E major might sound something like this. One simply has to be aware that this is an arrangement. One can play it in the same way one might play arrangements of Bach's works by Longo's contemporary Ferruccio Busoni. If one wants an authentic original version, there is no alternative but to use a harpsichord. Even though Scarlatti was an original innovator in his day, the work of the conservative Bach has survived to this day and remains alive. He, too, used compositional techniques that now seem thoroughly modern again. His most famous prelude, for instance, fits astonishingly well with the harmonic language of jazz, as this video shows. Have a look and subscribe to our channel because the best is yet to come. And do drop a comment below to let us know what you think of Scarlatti's sonatas.